Afternoon. Thanks for coming out on a very rainy day. We have an exceptionally distinguished panel. Apparently the panel knows half the people in the audience, so.
It's a distinguished audience.
In fact, the
audience is more distinguished than the panel.
I was going to say the audience may know more than the panel, but you feel free to interrupt. I think what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly. You know most of them anyhow. I'll then toss out a general question and we'll go into an open discussion. If you have a question, could you please hold up your hand, and I think we'll get a microphone. And if you could identify yourself, that would be great. In no particular order, let me begin with Ivan Schrager, who many of you know. He's a partner at Skadden Arps. He's the head of the CFIUS practice, and for me, he's the guru on CFIUS, although we have all gurus up here. But on some things, prior to Skadden, he was the chief counsel and staff director for the Senate Commerce Committee, where he worked on Exxon Florio and on some of the telecom agreements. He has on his resume that he was a senior advisor to John F. Kerry in the 2004 presidential campaign.
That's great.
And more importantly,
how'd that work out for me?
That's great. I only read what they give me. More importantly, he's on the board of visitors for the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences at Northwestern. So he gets to go to Evanston every once in a while. Next to me is Nova Daly, who's a senior public policy advisor at Wiley Ryan. Nova's held multiple positions at Treasury and Commerce, the White House, and the Senate. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Investment Security and Policy at the Treasury, oversaw numerous CFIUS transactions, developed the Open Investment Initiative, and was on the NSC. There's a lot more, but I just don't have time to read all the things Nova has done. At the far end is Matt Goodman, my colleague here at CSIS, who focuses on Asian economic issues and was, I think, both at the White House and Treasury. So a fairly distinguished group. Next to Matt is Clay Lowry, who many of us know. He's a managing director at Rock Creek Global Advisors. He was in the government for 15 years at Treasury, including things as the Paris Club debt negotiator. That's pretty cool. At the National Security Council, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Debt and Development. And of course, we all know him as the Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at Treasury, where he chaired CFIUS and worked on some of the more dramatic cases that led to our last reconsideration of this law. So very grateful that he's here. Finally, last but not least, Dov Zakheim, who is, by the way, a senior advisor at CSIS, previously a senior vice president at Booz Allen. More importantly from us, from a CSIS perspective, he was the DoD comptroller and the chief financial officer, so an immensely important position, and was the coordinator of civilian programs in Afghanistan.
That's enough.
No, I have more. Stop.
And that's not all.
He held multiple DoD posts, again, a long and distinguished career, and also worked at the Congressional Budget Office back in a long time ago.
A long time.
So we won't go into that. Anyhow, I can't think of a better group. I was really pleased that we could get them all. And these are the people who I would turn to for expertise on CFIUS. And I think what I told them we would do is start out with, I would kick it off with a general question, and then we would open it up for a conversation among the group. So it seems like every few years CFIUS comes back in the press. And the good news for you guys is you're not holding the bag this time, but someone is. And I think when I look at it, when I look at some of the issues we face, the first question I'd ask is the current law, the law, regulation, institutions that you help put in place, is it adequate? What more do we need to do? What's changed that might lead us to reconsider CFIUS? So I don't know, Matt, if you want to start, or?
Why don't we start with one of these distinguished lawyers,
Okay.
maybe.
I'm not a lawyer.
So, yeah, I'm the only lawyer on the panel.
That's why we
frightening.
said one of
right?
the lawyers.
Well, why don't I,
So,
you go.
So I'm looking at Bill Reinsch in the room, and I'm thinking, Bill in the 1980s called and they want their trade policy back. Because, if you look at what were the factors driving the original Exxon Florio legislation, it was protection of the defense industrial base, what we considered an aggressive trade partner from Asia who had targeted an industry. Sounds familiar, right? Only that time it was the Japanese and not the Chinese in semiconductors. And we didn't have a mechanism in place to really review what the implications were for foreign investment in the United States. So now we've had a couple decades of this, and then we did the legislation in 2008. But I think that we're always trying to keep up with trends both in the M&A world and emerging economic powers. And I think right now we've got an emerging economic power with also pretensions of being a global power, and that probably needs some more reflection.
Well said, more reflection. Yeah, so I'm actually going to defer to my boss at Treasury. Didn't we do it right, Clay, with the first legislation?
That's a given.
Well, did we do it right? No, because we were there during Dubai Port World, which was an embarrassment for our country. So obviously, when Dubai Port World broke back in 2006, it showed a lot of the flaws that were in the current system that had existed since Ivan was talking about in the 1980s. A lot of those flaws were, there were problems with accountability. Did anybody who has been Senate confirmed actually sign off on the deal? There were problems of how does the intelligence community interact with the CFIUS bodies, the different interagency process. And there was a process for that, but how formalized it was not very formalized. Was CFIUS kind of looking correctly at especially state-owned companies? And should those have more scrutiny given the fact that there's obviously going to be a nexus from a state-owned company more towards a political issues than just kind of businessmen trying to, or businesswomen trying to basically make money. And so I think that we did a lot back in 2006, 2007, and 2008, including fixing internally how we did things within the government, working with Congress to get a new law, doing an executive order to make sure that the government was talking to each other the right way, and doing regulations and putting them out. And I think that that's largely worked under the end of the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and even the start of this administration, the Trump administration. The issue is whether or not is it still working. And so the thing that people point to is that back when Nova and I were working on this back in 2007, 2008, you'd probably see 1 to 3 transactions a year coming from China. And if you read, the Rhodium report or AEI's investment tracker, you can tell the Chinese are doing a heck of a lot more foreign direct investment. And probably last year there was 170 cases in CFIUS. One would guess that about 75 or 80 of them were from China. We don't know, but let's just assume it is the case. Is that a problem? And if it is how do we address it? So we all know that there's a bunch of different congressional efforts trying to figure out how to reform CFIUS. The one question I haven't heard anybody answer correctly, or correctly is the wrong word, haven't heard anybody answer is whether or not is there a specific issue or is there a specific case where CFIUS has clearly just fallen down on the job and not done it correctly and so therefore potentially harmed our national security? I haven't heard one person answer, yes, I got an example for you. But that said, that doesn't mean that there aren't reforms.
This is over. We can
Well,
have that
there's something
conversation.
else too. I mean, there are several issues that arise here. I mean, one is
even if CFIUS hasn't fallen down, what about its scope? And what about the things that are not officially, or currently is probably more accurate, under CFIUS's purview? Now, you've got a country that's very different from Japan in the 80s. A, they ain't an ally, that's for sure. B, they've got tons of money. We really don't know how much, they don't really know how much, but they know they've got whatever they need to spend on whatever they want, because they buy things at huge premiums, for instance. C, there are so many new ways of investing, so many new vehicles. So what do you do about a joint venture that's basically organized overseas? What do you do about transfer of intellectual property as opposed to actual things you can pick up and hold, or put your arms around, or whatever term you want to use? What do you do about, in effect, funds that are privately held, where you don't know who actually is there, where you don't have to reveal who's there? None of this is what CFIUS looks at now. And so one of the questions is, should CFIUS be the one to look at it? That brings you back to what Clay just said, which is, they've got a pretty big load right now. And there's another issue with CFIUS, I think, which is, it's pretty much a consensus operation. Is that what you really want?
Well, I'll pick up on that, because I'll pick on a couple things, but I think you're right about consensus, because I think one of the things that has not worked well in the post-FINSA world is this drive towards consensus. And the internal debate within the government, where the parties really aren't playing a role in that, I think has hurt the process. I long for the days when, knowing I would have an issue with the Defense Department or with the Justice Department, I could interact with them way before filing. So I think one of the deficiencies of the new process is we used to really use the pre-filing period. I mean, Clay, you'll remember in Alcatel-Lucent, we spent like 5-6 months way before we filed to really understand what the implications of the transaction were. I think we've given that up because of FINSA. But the second part, and where Clay was starting, the new legislation, FINSA and the FINSA reforms really had more of a political component to it than I think it had an industrial policy component to it, or a investment policy component to it. It was, do we have high-level sign-off? Are we going to get dragged up to the hill? When what we really should be doing, to Doug's point, is taking a look, and what the original intent of Ex Florio was, what are the implications for the defense industrial base? What are the implications for maintaining technology and technological skills here? How does foreign investment actually benefit us, both from a national security perspective, strengthening alliances, but also, you're involved in a company where I think, had they not done an Asian transaction, they wouldn't be able to serve the defense market in the way they serve the defense market currently, because the consumer business, which was already migrating towards Asia, needed that flexibility on price to protect their high margin business here. So I think, we need to do a better job figuring out, why do we want to attract foreign investment? How can we do it in a way that protects jobs, skills, technology, and national security? And rather than focus on what are the political implications, because the administration is going to get tagged for being weak on port security.
Let me give you a couple of other things to think about. One is, how do you define national security? So if you're buying a food company, like one that's been bought, and our friends overseas decide to poison the food that they produce, that's national security. How does CFIUS look at that? How do we look at agricultural products? Another thing to consider is, in my experience, both in the Pentagon, well, I still go in and out all the time, so I see this. This is fundamentally a collateral duty for the Pentagon, which means that guys like Paul Halperin are working 23 hours a day because they don't have big enough staff. And so leaving...
Right, so should we have a filing fee to pay for new staff?
Who knows? But in addition to what you said, which is essentially they're overloaded. Now you've got to break down the component parts and see the component parts are overloaded. So that this whole system is really threatened by collapse. And, you know, so we moan and moan and moan about what the Chinese are doing to us and their reports and this and that. But, and as a guy who thinks that we probably ought to cut back on civilian personnel, this is one area where we should add to it.
So I think all learned a lot just from all of that. But I would say, look, I joined the U.S. Treasury in 1988, the summer of 1988. And two things are significant about that from this point of view. One, it was when we were at the depth of this economic tension with Japan, and a lot of that was centered on investment, and in fact, Exxon Florio, as you said, Ivan, came out of that. And the other thing was, as Clay and I guess Nova know, when you join Treasury your first week, you get a little chip planted in the back of your brain, part of which says, thou shalt never talk about currencies. But the other part is that an open investment climate is, you know, good for the United States. It's good for growth, it's good for jobs, it's good for competitiveness. But Treasury is also a national security agency, and Treasury cares about national security, and so, you know, we yield to no one in our determination to protect the U.S. national security. So we need to look at that carefully. I think, in my experience sort of dabbling, and like these guys who are real professionals over the years, that CFIUS has done that job and balanced all of that pretty well. And so my perspective now is let's not fundamentally change something that is working fundamentally at doing what it's supposed to do and has the flexibility to do what it wants to do, needs to do. And let's definitely not do silly stuff as we did with Japan back in the 80s, or with Dubai ports a little bit later. I wasn't fortunately involved in that, although I saw you about a week after you took over as assistant secretary, and I don't think you ever had heard the word CFIUS before you took that job, and you were saying, what the hell is this? How did I take this thing on?
It's not
But,
totally true.
but it was, but I would say, but it does seem to me that there's some things that could be tweaked. I mean, it sounds like some of the things that have been mentioned, like more capacity, more ability to really have the capacity to sort of analyze what the risks are, because I think maybe things are different now that you're talking about not just you know, a big purchase of some big thing that we can all see and we can analyze, you know, what this single thing, what the importance of an energy company is or something. You're now looking at lots of little things that are scattered around that are hard to see, and you probably need additional analytical capabilities to understand what the connections are between these things. That may make sense. Maybe the greenfield exemption, where, you know, CFIUS can't look at, you know, new building up of a business from the ground up as opposed to acquiring things. So there sounds like there's some, you know, reasonable fixes that could be made, but fundamentally don't change it. And definitely my instinct is don't put an economic test in there. Some of the legislative proposals are to put in an economic test into CFIUS. That seems to me like a slippery slope that would open up the door to all kinds of bad things that we don't want to do, and that would tip that balance. On the other hand, one final point, I mean, I do think China's different, and let's just be honest, we said the word China, but I mean, that's the country we're worried about, and it is different for a number of reasons, as Dov said. You know, it's a lot bigger than Japan was. It's, you know, the state is still got a pervasive role in the economy. It's got a plan, Made in China 2025 or whatever you want to call it. There's a plan, and that involves acquiring, you know, overseas assets. It's got lots of firepower and money it's putting behind it. And, you know, again, it's a strategic adversary. It's not an ally the way Japan was. So there is something different about China, and I do think we have to it would be naive and dangerous to not be looking at realistically what additional risks China poses. But in my view, that doesn't mean a fundamental overhaul of CFIUS. It feels like CFIUS can do what it needs to do.
Well, this one, I can really only speak from a defense perspective. So we've got this thing called DIUX, which is a little agency, really small, that's meant to reach out to Silicon Valley and pick up technologies and prototype them. Now, if you know anything about the Defense Department, prototyping ain't gonna get you very far, because as soon as you put it into the system, they will, what's called military specifications, mil specs, It'll have to operate in the North Pole and the equator at the same time. All kinds of reasons why by the time they're finished with bells and whistles, you don't even recognize the system anymore, except that it costs 20 times as much. But leaving that aside, we are terrible at reaching out to the non-defense base, industrial base. That's why this thing was created. The Chinese are terrific at it because all these venture capitalists, they just happen to be Chinese. And they see a product that for bureaucratic reasons we don't touch. And they go, okay, how much do you need? I'll give it to you. And then all of a sudden, CFIUS doesn't even play.
I'm thinking about, you're coming from the DoD perspective. The one part of the government that I think does a very good job in taking commercial off-the-shelf product and customizing it is the IC. I mean, I think the intelligence community
They're good at it.
Much better at identifying technologies that could be useful without being burdened by all the mil-spec. I want to go back to a point that was raised earlier, though. Look, I think we need to do a better job. Look, we're all focused on China today. We need to do a better job of triage within the process, right? Because not all cases are the same. And if we have a resource issue, you got this limitation of you can't kick a case out before the end of 30 days. And for some of the cases, they really should be kicked out. Some cases probably shouldn't be filed, and I can get to whether or not it should be a mandatory filing or a voluntary filing. Those cases should, but you should have a mechanism to get rid of the easy cases. I think you should have a mechanism where 27 days is not enough time for the D&I to really write an adequate report about the connections of a Chinese state-owned enterprise, or the connections of an Israeli company, or a French company that has government ownership. So I would, I think the clock needs to be more flexible. When I do regulatory reviews before the FCC or the FTC, you have a process to start and stop the clock. And I think for difficult cases, you really need that flexibility for the agencies to focus on what the actual concerns might be. So, and then, I might have mentioned this before, Hart-Scott-Rodino has a filing fee. If I'm doing a $35 billion transaction through CFIUS, and if I have a filing fee, like in the antitrust division, I mean, a second request in antitrust division is a very labor-intensive process. And if I had more, if Treasury or some DoD had more resources, I think you need more people in that process. And more importantly, more industry expertise, right? How much time did you get? You guys learned a lot about a lot of different industries because you had to get up to speed about what are the real vulnerabilities of, say, a network printer that sits behind a firewall with very little protection.
By the way,
Go ahead.
Ivan mentioned two friendly countries. And I think that's one of the reasons why stuff I hear kicking around the hill about allies versus not allies. Well, guess what? Some of our allies are very good at finding out what we're up to. And we need to be careful about that as well. And so that's one distinction I simply would not make. I would look at what it is that somebody's buying or investing in or whatever it might be, and make your decision on the basis of that.
Remember, we added the state-owned enterprise provision to address French investment in the United States.
That's right. And so that's an area that I think, again, we've got to be very careful about. I personally think that it's not so much changing CFIUS as expanding its scope, if that's the way you want to go. And there's a debate about that. Should you have another agency do that? My instincts are, you create an agency, you create a bureaucracy, you haven't solved your problem. But the issue of scope, I think, is really central, because these guys are just very, very clever at finding new ways to invest that simply skirt our laws.
But having the right people, I mean, look, we're not going to pump up our panel here, but having like Clay and Nova and having people who pay attention to the stuff on a regular basis and understand the remit is very important. I mean, personalities in this process become very important. And having high-level people engaged on a regular basis is very important because there are big policy issues at stake. I mean, both your administration was very good at ensuring that, I mean, you learned a hard lesson, but ensuring that senior level people paid attention.
And with Treasury as the leader, which they should be, if you get those kinds of people, you're going to get better people coming out of places like defense as well. If the sense is that, you know, it's rudderless, then DOD will say, okay, who's got nothing to do today?
Clay, you were going to add something to that?
What did I just know that Nova hadn't spoken, so I wanted to.
I noticed that too, but you were.
I gave him his opening.
I know, I'll let it go.
Okay, that's your cue.
All right, so the cue. So fixes to CFIUS. What is going to burn CFIUS, like what burned us in Dubai Ports World, is the non-notified process. It's a voluntary process. So inevitably, you're going to see a transaction that wasn't reviewed, wasn't filed, that someone found, and that had serious national security issues and wasn't addressed. And someone's going to scream about it on the Hill and say, why didn't you deal with this? And it's going to blow up. So I don't know how to deal with that. You don't, and then the question this panel and others have to answer is, does CFIUS become a mandatory process for some investments? Or does it remain ostensibly a voluntary process? The problem is that when you have a blow up like Dubai Ports World, you get legislation, possible legislation, that can be very horrible for US investment. And then you get other countries reciprocally doing investments or creating new laws that could be even worse. So getting it right in the United States is a leadership issue. So I'd like to find some ways, or think about some ways, to address the non-notified, the voluntary process, and not having a blow up on the backside. To the issue of investments structured or designed to avoid CFIUS, which is one of the regulatory components we have to address it, that being IP acquisitions that are then taken outside the United States, or joint ventures constructed for the purpose of pulling the IP away from the United States and then avoiding CFIUS. I think that's something that merits reflection in terms of looking at what CFIUS should and ought to do. I think those are some of the big components. Private equity companies and how they operate behind sort of curtains of ownership. You know, I don't know how you address that either in, you know, filings, other filings in the United States, or if it's an issue you can address otherwise in the CFIUS process by taking a look at whether, because we have an example on there. Two examples of private equity investments, both saying 49% ownership by two limited partners versus a general partner with 2%, isn't a covered transaction. So imagine someone's giving you 98% of all the money in a fund that acquires something. You only own 2%, but you're the general partner, so you get to determine everything, and they don't. Well, that...
Do you have any specific
I was going
transactions?
to ask. Sounded vaguely familiar, but...
It really does. So I think maybe we got to take a look and reflect a little bit on that. But
Clay?
So the only thing, a couple things. One, a couple of the criticisms of CFIUS exists. On the private equity side and kind of the ownership, I mean, CFIUS has to look at that. And if they're not looking at that carefully right now, then that really is a flaw in the system. And yes, obviously, and there are some really weird structures in there about how investments are done and put together. But that is where CFIUS has to dig. And if they have to, I agree with Ivan's point about if there was a way to stop the clock, that would be a really nice thing to do, as opposed to kind of the awkwardness of the withdrawal refile process, which is basically how CFIUS
Great for the ARBs, though.
So they should be doing that. To some of the points that Dov raised, and I don't disagree with it, on the DIUX report, which of course is classified, but it was of course written up in the New York Times, which is an interesting point. But the
I didn't quote the report.
supposedly classified, I guess. New York Times reporters are okay. But the issue that I have is what tool makes the most sense. So if your tool is that I'm going to look at every time a foreigner invests in something that is not a deemed export problem from an export control process, Then it gets into a lot of speculation as to what is technologically important and what isn't. And so somehow the government's going to have to make decisions on that based on what? I mean, a venture capital fund is may not be investing 15% or 20%. They may be investing a couple percent and putting some loans out there. And if that is getting Chinese investment, that's an important thing. We should look at it. But is CFIUS the way to handle that? Or should we be looking at whether or not is our export control laws put in place the correct way? Or should we be looking at something that Dov knows 50 times more than I do about, which is our defense procurement processes working the correct way? Secondly, if we're looking at joint ventures overseas, so basically an extraterritorial application of CFIUS, now, is that, if you do look at critical technology, critical infrastructure, most energy companies, to my knowledge, when they do work overseas, they do them through joint ventures. Okay, energy is considered a critical technology according to the CFIUS law. So therefore, any time that an energy company from the United States does a deal overseas, they're probably going to have to go through a CFIUS process. If I was one of their competitors from France or England or Russia or wherever, I certainly would use that as a competitiveness stick. Hey, those guys have to go through CFIUS. We don't have to worry about that stuff. So I think looking at and figuring out whether reports like whatever the DIUX is working on or some of the concerns people are raising is totally legitimate and people should be thinking about it and CFIUS should be on the table. I guess I would suggest that we should also be trying to figure out whether or not it is the tool or is it potentially a tool in some certain areas. Because if you expand the universe of what CFIUS should look at, that's fine. And we may be able to do some better triage, and we may get fees for service, but I promise you, given what I just saw from the skinny budget, so to speak, there are not going to be enough people within our government currently or any time in the near future that will be able to handle what we're talking about.
Well, you have this dilemma in the CFIUS process, but it's not uncommon in a regulatory review process. So I told a friend once who became chairman of the FCC that don't focus on new telecom legislation because through the merger review process, you're going to do more on open access and all the issues that were important in the FCC. And ironically, I mean, take cybersecurity, for example. We have one tier 1 network in the United States right now that's subject to a CFIUS agreement. And they have more protections around their procurement process than AT&T and Verizon. And what you're doing almost incrementally through transactions is addressing cybersecurity or addressing technology transfer. And I think you raise an absolutely critical point. Ironically, that's not how we're supposed to make policy in the United States, but what we end up doing is making policy, transaction through transaction.
So some of the issues that have come up are, do we see an intentional effort by Chinese investors with the Chinese state behind them to circumvent CFIUS, right? And you could make a case for that. You could also make a case that there's a lot of money floating around in China. The Chinese are eager to get it out while they still can, and you can have both explanations.
You can make the case,
time.
but I think you'd have trouble with a straight face.
No, I was
and let me
sure
tell
I
you.
agree
Let me
with
give you an example.
Uh-huh.
So this comes from a Russian, okay, a very senior Russian, who told me that some years back there was a huge Chinese delegation at one of their aircraft factories. And they were thinking about purchasing, it was Sukhoi. And so, they all come, they exchange cards, they take a photo and this kind of thing. And then the senior guys say, look, let's just meet 2-on-2 or 3-on-3 or whatever. And the rest of these guys will wait outside. Well, the rest of those guys didn't wait outside. They split up in groups of 2. And they started going around the plant and asking each manager just 3 questions. And then when they got home, they kludged all the questions together. They never bought the aircraft. But then a few years later, the Russians saw their aircraft, except it was Chinese. Don't tell me that there isn't a certain intention behind what they're doing.
But I think it's,
And that's what they're doing to supposedly their friends.
look, I think it's true, but it's not black and white. I think there's a lot of money sloshing around China, and they're pursuing a lot of deals. And it's also an opportunity for the U.S. to have a better understanding of who's up and who's down in China. I mean,
I'm not saying there shouldn't be deals.
No, but look, I mean, I think China operates under rules that are fundamental. I think a lot of Asian economies operate under rules that are fundamentally different than ours. Like the Koreans and the Japanese have a different capitals between keiretsus and chaebols, and it's just a different system and a different structure, and creates investment impediments to U.S. companies. But I think the Chinese, I mean, clearly they have, China 2025, but it's not so black and white. I mean, there are also a lot of guys running around hustling in China just trying to make a ton of money because they've been told to go out and buy things. And it's not just, from my experience of doing a fair number of Chinese deals, if this is like centrally driven, man, it's not a very good.
But it's not an issue of whether it's centrally driven or not. You have to look at it, I think, I guess I'm just talking like a defense guy. You've got to look at it from the perspective of what if. I mean, essentially, you got a worst case the issue. So yes, it might be some private person who's out to make his or her billions and then, whatever. But suppose it's not. And then you have to look at the technology we're talking about. And of course, the big issue is our own people won't buy it because of their arcane rules, and those folks can. But the issue is this really a technology that could cause us damage? And if it is, and then you sort of say, well, okay, I'm running a risk. I mean, it's basically a risk
But I want to
analysis.
ask Nova and Clay this because they have more experience than anybody. Do you think mitigation structures work?
I do think mitigation structures work because if they weren't in place, there would be a lot more rejections. First off, unless you have a mitigation structure in there to present a way for the United States government to have feel secure in allowing that transaction to happen, you're just going to have a lot of blocks. I think mitigation agreements and their enforcement necessitate more resources. And I think it's under the reliance of U.S. citizens who work in those companies that are part of that mitigation to adhere to it. So there's a trust level that's necessary, but I say on the whole, yes.
Yeah, but
Clay, you have an opinion on mitigation structures? Since you were teasing me in the green room about how we slice and dice things.
well, you are Mr. Mitigation.
I think Nova makes a very good point, which is mitigation helps get some deals that are tough through, and that's actually a really important point. Look, there's some mitigation that is, I think they work at large part. I think there's sometimes, to be frank, that the U.S. government goes way beyond what would be considered law or even values. I mean, talk about not focusing on incremental risk. I mean, there are times where the U.S. government will come in and there's a deal made and they will say, we don't want, in the new arrangement, no foreigner should work on X.
Yes.
Well, in the current arrangement, if there was no deal on the table, there's plenty of foreigners working on X. And so it never made any sense to me. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure I signed off on the deals that did this. But where I was just like, well, hold on, we have no legal standing to ask for this, zero. It almost goes against a lot of things that we supposedly believe in. And yet all of a sudden we're going to basically say that because we now have somebody under the thumb. And you do. I mean, when when you're under CFIUS, I mean, Ivan knows this better than me, there's a feel that there may be some sort of a negotiation. I'm telling you, the government has all the power.
Yep.
So I worry about that within mitigation agreements, but that's a different
But
point.
in FinCEN, Clay, we have that CFIUS may impose mitigation, may impose. by
Well,
law.
look, I personally think that there's a lot of merit to mitigation agreements
I agree
because
with
they essentially, I mean, in general, they essentially protect us without blocking the business.
I agree.
To me, the issue really is, what is CFIUS's scope? Is that these things we've talked about, these new areas, should that come under CFIUS? If it comes under CFIUS, then you'll figure out a way to have a mitigation agreement so that Ivan can keep on working.
Yeah, I have 4 children and they're college age.
But the central question is, there are all these new investment vehicles that we simply haven't figured out how to address. If we figure out how to address them, who should address them, how they should address them, and I think things like mitigation agreements will fit in under that system. We just don't have a system in mind.
I think what the government doesn't do well with mitigation is look at mitigation holistically and what they can gain out of mitigation.
That's true too.
You know, I think that there are counter opportunities that are presented by mitigation that aren't taken into consideration. And you know, but to Clay's point, the worst thing I ever saw in the time I was practicing was CFIUS demanded that a collection of H-1B visa holders, and these are people who, you know, the government had signed off on, were important to the U.S. economy. They were fired from working, and so, right, we had to let them go. They had all the knowledge of a certain program, and from a security risk, you just send people away from the United States with knowledge of algorithms that were critical to a program in the United States. You just created a huge security risk. And so I think there's, I mean, I like to tell my clients.
I wasn't involved in that one.
Yeah, we were not involved.
You were not involved. That was an Obama administration. And I tell my clients all the time, you know, welcome to CFIUS. You have entered the logic-free zone.
Yeah, it's a logic-free zone, but I actually, listening to this, I think this confirms to me that CFIUS works pretty well, because this kind of debate goes on, in my experience, and none of us are in the room now, so I don't know what it's like now, but in the few times that I've sort of, over my career, been in CFIUS rooms, it's this kind of debate where reasonable people can disagree about, you know, at the margin, whether this is the right, you know, should we mitigate, shouldn't we, is it, you know, and we probably get it wrong a bunch of times, but on balance, with a bunch of smart people, well-intentioned, focused on, really on national security, and that was a point I wanted to make. I think the conversation is about national security. Yeah. It's not, you know, there are people outside who think that it's, other things are being talked about, you know, about trying to preserve, you know, jobs or some competitiveness position. It's really not about that, in my opinion. There's a robust debate between what I call the Mars and the Venus agencies about, you know, about these
Definitely
things.
Definitely a treasury
and it comes
guy
out,
right here.
It comes out in a, you know, I think more often than not, it comes out in a reasonable place. It may, you know, so I think that's why I wouldn't mess with it too much. At the margin, I can see that there, you know, I think the greater analytical capability and resources to be able to really understand transactions that may pose national security risks. I think in the new, more complex and less transparent sort of economy that we live in, faster moving, that seems to make sense to me. But I wouldn't mess with this debate fundamentally.
Yet we have on the Hill more attention to
Yep.
CFIUS than we've had in years, and there's at least 4 different efforts to amend it, to amend FINSA, to expand scope or to make things mandatory or protect agriculture. And I'm told, so, you know, last week I was checking around and people said some of these have legs.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh,
So what do you think about what's going on the Hill? If CFIUS is working, why is there suddenly this outburst of attention from some pretty sharp, some of the senators involved are pretty sharp, right? Notice I excluded the House, but I didn't do that intentionally.
I'm a Senate guy. So.
Yeah, so I didn't mean any disrespect to the House, but certainly some of the, Cornyn, Schumer, these are people who are pretty astute, and yet they feel the need to change CFIUS.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, when you see, and I think this goes to the discussion of that Clay had raised about the influx of Chinese investment and our relationship vis-a-vis China and what it means, and with the discussion of China and the U.S.-China relationship being a key issue in these elections, I think it merits consideration. What is the policy regarding China, whether that be trade, investment, and national security? And I think CFIUS is one of the elements within that spectrum of issues and that relationship that has to be evaluated in those terms.
I don't know the Hill as well as you guys, but I suspect some of this is kind of negotiating leverage. I mean, even Schumer, who has used things like this before to get attention, whether it was on currency stuff. I'm not sure he really wanted to put 27.5% tariffs on Chinese imports, but he was trying to get China's attention to this concern he has. And I think here, maybe with the economic test, he's worried about other things that I think are legitimate. And I would say outside of CFIUS, I think there are a number of things we ought to be looking at in terms of our China strategy, that are trying to get, a more open market there, get them back on the track of reform, to sort of level the playing field, as it were. So I don't know whether how serious these things are as actual things people want changed, as opposed to trying to get attention to a bunch of issues that we're worried about. Some more than others, probably. Let's
look at the fundamental proposition. So we do transactions all over the world. I've appeared in front of the French CFIUS review process. The U.S. is by far the most open investment country in the world, maybe with the exception of Singapore. I mean, do a transaction, try to do a deal in Germany or in France or in China, or do a hostile takeover in Japan. Well, that doesn't really happen. So this notion that CFIUS is this incredible bar to foreign investment and we're the only people who do this, I can't accept that. I think the big question, and Novin raised this earlier, is do you make it mandatory? Because I think that takes away the incentive to try to structure around it or look for examples in the regs. And if I structure it this way, is this not a covered transaction? I can get you. Make it mandatory and then kick it out in 15 days. Now, I mean, every UK fund with real legitimate partners shouldn't be treated the same way as certain other deals. So make it mandatory. Put a filing fee in. But none of this stuff is it's all China related. When you get right, agriculture, that's really China related. It's ChemChina, Sargenta, and the pork deal.
Well, mandatory at thresholds or just mandatory?
Well, so we like to say it's if your size doesn't matter, right? Because you can do, to Doug's point, you can do a smaller technology. Look, the most expensive transaction in the history of Huawei was a $3.5 million deal, right? I mean, size matters because a small piece of technology can be very critical to the U.S. I don't know if it was modeled on Hart-Scott-Rodino, and HSR has, filing thresholds. I'm not sure I would do that.
By the way, I agree with Ivan in terms of the fundamental fact that people invest in the United States. I mean, think about FCP, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. All right? We are as tough as anybody on FCPA. We have many of our allies who are very forget about the Chinese. Many of our allies who are very lavish in bribing people. People still buy our stuff. Why do they buy our stuff?
Such a pejorative
Because, well, that's why I used it.
It's hire as consultant.
Why do they buy our stuff? Because it's better. Because we help them maintain it, or what, lots of good reasons. Same thing. Why do people invest in the United States, or not invest? I guarantee you, nobody, frankly, is not going to make what they think is a terrific investment in the United States because of CFIUS.
The funny thing, we're not talking about things that can actually make the process better than legislation. Like for the warfighter, for example, mirroring technology from a NATO ally into a system in a way that you can actually integrate it may be a better solution for the warfighter without putting a Stalinist DSS structure in place that doesn't enable the cooperation.
And then you got to weigh the risk of. But you got to weigh the risk of, okay, you do that, but are you at the same time giving technology to a country that is immediately going to peddle it to everybody else, or leak it to whoever? I mean, these are issues.
Are you suggesting some of our allies are better than others?
I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it. I mean, they're frankly, in my view, and I've said this openly, and I've said it to them, there are only two allies we can trust completely, 100%, Australia and the Brits, and nobody else.
You wouldn't put the Canadians in there?
Well, it depends. Mr. Chrétien wasn't entirely trustworthy.
Boy, we're just setting fires left and right. It's like, oh, cow.
And I'm not
Otto
Mr.
was
Trump. I
calling
love
you.
alliances.
They want to know.
I love alliances, but there are alliances and alliances.
There's a back door, and we'll be using it. So.
And I'm fine. You can throw your tomatoes at me.
Look, there is a number of legislative proposals up there. One thing that would be helpful to do is to answer the question, is there a problem that they're trying to address? Dov has pointed out where he thinks there may be some problems. Many people in Congress, some of them who are actually trying to think about doing reform bills, have asked the GAO to do a study on CFIUS and look at a number of things. Some would suggest you might actually wait for that study to come out before you actually try to legislate. I'm sure that wouldn't be the case, but seems like a decent starting point for me, so you could actually have some analysis. But the only thing I'd ask is, if you're going to make some reforms, and I think there are some reforms that probably could be made, how do you do it so you don't create bigger problems? I agree with Ivan's point about the United States is very open to investment, probably more open than any major economy in the world. I'm actually not in favor of emulating all those other countries. I actually kind of like the way we do things, and I think it's been helpful to our economy for a long time. If you make it mandatory, right now CFIUS deals with, and everybody's acknowledged up here, that CFIUS is overwhelmed with 160, 170 transactions a year. If you make it mandatory, assume it'll be 10 times that amount, at least. So be a little careful on making it mandatory. I think if gun pressed ahead by the Canadians on me, I would probably say you should make it maybe state-owned enterprises are mandatory. If you wanted to figure out a way to carve it up further, you could do it in certain industries with state-owned enterprises. I don't know. But that's probably where I would start looking. And I'd be a little more careful on things like, as Matt said, on net economic benefit tests and reciprocity tests and things like that, where you're going to lead towards rent-seeking behavior. You see it all the time now, and we don't even have it. Just assume it'll become
Don't
worse.
make it mandatory. I'm going to pick on wrench again, because we used to put together lists of critical technologies and ask the Commerce Department, Defense Department to come up annually with a list of critical technologies. If you're doing a transaction company or a sector that's on that critical technology list, should that be a mandatory filing?
So critical technologies is actually, or critical infrastructure, depends on how you look at it, is a
talking
wider
about infrastructure, I'm
swath
just talking about
than people
technology.
think it is. But I mean, really, critical technologies most of the time is being filed.
Right.
Are there non-notified transactions out there? So non-notified transactions, Nova referred to this earlier, where basically somebody buys something in a national security area, it's a controlling investment, and they don't notify CFIUS. Now, there's always been the sword of Damocles theory about that, which is, do I really, as an attorney, want to tell, as an M&A attorney, say, don't worry about filing this, but if CFIUS wants to, they could reach back 2 years after the transaction is done and actually come in and say, tap you on the shoulder, we want to look at this, and you could break up the transaction. That's a dangerous position for, I assume, shareholders to be in.
Yeah, the safe harbor definitely is.
But that means that the government has to do a lot of work. It means that they have to, and they're very busy people, and they have to make sure that they follow as best as they possibly can what's happening in the M&A press, what's happening, because if not, things will slip by.
Well, there's something else too. I mean, the sword of Damocles works if you know there's a sword of Damocles. And frankly, not everybody goes to Ivan. And so if you're going to a small law firm somewhere, they may not even know very much. They won't know how to advise. I kind of like Ivan's idea. I mean, I'm very, very nervous about just sort of categorizing allies or not allies, but going after countries that have state-owned enterprises, which will then leave my Canadians off the hook, and then they can like me again. But
that's
actually not.
But a lot of Europeans are.
but a lot of Europeans are. And
Remember, state-owned enterprises includes the very vicious Ontario Teachers Pensions Plan.
Well, there is that.
Frequent filer.
There is that. But then again, I think if you narrow it to state-owned enterprises, and then maybe you then discriminate between a teacher's pension fund and some other companies, which will not be mentioned, but if you don't know who they are, then you probably wouldn't be here. I think that allows the government to, first of all, go deeper. It's not expanding scope, but it's going deeper in the vertical it's already in without necessarily overwhelming a staff that really is overburdened right now. It's not a bad differentiator.
So I'm going to disagree a little bit on
With yourself?
No, because I was critical technologies, not state-owned enterprises. It was Clay with state-owned enterprises. And so I'm going to disagree
And I
with one.
said it was worth exploring.
Look, because, again, the definition of state-owned enterprises includes people with a golden share, it includes,
Rolls-Royce.
it includes Rolls-Royce, for example, it includes Ontario Teachers Pension. I do think that we ought to focus on critical technology. I mean, the transaction that got us probably this event was a state-owned enterprise who didn't get a full investigation, right? It was Dubai Ports.
Yeah.
You didn't take it to the full 75-day review. You didn't follow the Byrd Amendment from '91. And Admiral Mullen was laughing, who's a director for a CFIUS mitigation agreement, was laughing. It was like the first time he heard about CFIUS was when he was chair. I think one of his charges was cutting a ribbon in the Gulf at a new naval facility in the Gulf while Schumer was complaining about the danger that was being presented by Dubai Ports. So, I think if you're going to focus on state-owned enterprises, you should focus on the criticalness of the asset and the technology.
Well, it's a matrix, essentially.
Yeah.
And what I was simply saying was I agree that you can't just open this up entirely, because then either you have to give CFIUS a lot more people, which is what Clay said, or you create a new organization with all the bureaucratic hiccups that creates as well. So you need some kind of mechanism to figure out, how do I bore in on the things that I really care about? And so I think maybe a combination of SOEs and what they're actually, and the subject matter is not a bad way to go.
What were the things that, when you were in the process, that you kind of lost sleep over? You thought, God, if this happens, or if it goes the wrong way, something bad's going to happen.
In terms of a case?
Yeah. Well, you don't have to mention a specific case, but a general text.
Oh, well, I mean,
Technology.
what's that? I mean, is it critical technology, critical infrastructure, obviously things that could, the ability of an actor to take actions, or an actor unknowingly, because they hired a bad actor in the process, to take actions that would debilitate the United States, whether that was taking actions on something that was critical technology or infrastructure, or critical economic piece of infrastructure too, right? So we don't want the Wall Street Journal, Wall Street, New York Times, not the Times, I don't know, well,
Right, so you
NASDAQ to go
You have
down.
a Mexican billionaire who owns a good percentage of the New York Times, and you have an Australian who owns the Wall Street Journal.
I didn't mean
US
I was actually meaning NASDAQ or the stock exchange. That's where I was going.
We did make it.
So
Yes,
for
you
me,
did.
it really was just, it was the cutting edge technology issues would keep me up at night, because I felt like the government didn't know enough to protect it in some respects. So that one's the ones that would get me scared. By the way, it almost didn't matter who the purchaser was. And then actually even worse, again, my nightmare, I'm not saying this was happening, is the fact that you might have engineers, brilliant people within the organization, the company itself that is being purchased, that don't even know what they're sitting on in some respects. Their own knowledge could be utilized for a military or intelligence application, which they have not even thought of themselves, but potentially the purchaser has. That would scare me.
And we're seeing more cases like that.
And by the way, I mean, for instance, the DoD Acquisition Corps itself is not always up to speed in terms of the latest technologies. So they're not going to appreciate what these implications are. And very often, DoD relies on contractors. Well, you can't rely on contractors for this one. So either you know the answer yourself, or you don't know the answer. And that can be really troubling.
Is a lot of what's driving this, though, if you polled people, I think the thing that would come to the top would be in your slice about how could we slice away from mandatory for all transactions. It would be semiconductors, microelectronics, China. So how much of this is driven by that? And in the past, and Dubai Ports is a classic example, usually there's been a particular transaction that triggered the whole reform effort, and we haven't seen that yet. We've come close to the edge a couple times.
So how many people here remember Fairchild? Right? I mean, that drove it back in the 80s.
Well, we had 3.
Right? We had just done Semitech. And we had identified this sector that was critical, and we had self-initiated dumping cases. We had 301 action. We had a whole policy to protect the semiconductor industry, and the Japanese were buying it. So
And the Chinese tried to buy Fairchild.
recently.
Yeah.
So do we need to do anything special for that sector?
Well, that's why I go back to kind of critical technologies and process technologies, and I think AT&L and others do a good job of identifying both current and future technologies.
That's not what you always say.
And it's not entirely accurate.
Paul, there were times when you were in the process where I thought you did a good
I
job.
think the reason AT&L doesn't always do it is, one, that doesn't have enough staff, and B, it's not all the staff are sufficiently educated consumers. I mean, let's be honest about that. I just was on the Hill this week testifying to the fact that you can get a master's degree and come in as a very bright spark at the age of 25 and then not take another course in anything because you're not forced to for 40 years. And think about how Moore's Law is working those 40 years.
But here's where I would change the process right now, because I think, the companies, the engineers within companies, the bankers involved in the process usually understand the industry and the sector. And one of the downsides of FIDSA is it really kind of just, and again, it's personality driven, I think it discouraged some of that interaction. And the one thing I would change is, particularly in a hard case involving technology, using the parties to educate people on what the technology does, what it doesn't do, what the implications are.
Exactly right.
It should be more of a collaborative process. It's not an adversarial process.
I totally agree with that.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, that's why I do the Alcatel-Lucent deal.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a long process, but it was an educational process, and that's key if you're going to get it right in government.
Can we get that sort of relationship with Chinese companies? Alcatel-Lucent, so it's about as close as you could get.
French and the Chinese, or is it?
Yeah, I am to some extent. So, but if you could do Alcatel-Lucent.
Remember, it's a lot of times it's what's being purchased, which is usually not Chinese, it's American, right?
That's
And
right.
So, or it doesn't have to be American, but so you
Yeah.
can have that type of relationship, and you can actually. I mean, I always was a believer we should have the expert within whatever company it is talking to the expert at the Department of Defense or DHS or wherever. And yeah, should Treasury be sitting in the room? Yeah, but look, I didn't understand those issues, but I know that if something goes wrong, frankly, Nova or me was going to be the ones who were going to get called up and have to testify. So I would want to be in the room, or I'd want Nova or one of his people in the room so that we could at least make sure that we were as educated as possible, even though we would never know 5% of what the two engineers were talking about.
Yeah, but we did a Chinese deal in the telecom equipment space, right? So kind of a scary prospect. And before we signed, we spent a couple months bringing the boxes in and showing DoD and Paul's team, here's what the box does, here's what it doesn't do, and the transaction got approved. So yeah, I think to your question, can you do it with the Chinese? Yeah, you don't even have to have the Chinese in the room. You have to have the company in the room explaining the technology.
Yeah, and oh, by the way, if the Americans weren't involved, we wouldn't be talking about this. So by definition, any deal, whether it's Chinese, French, Israeli, Canadian, whatever, is going to have an American side. And the American, well, maybe it'll have some other side. And what you then can do is you call the American side in. If they don't know the technology, that's kind of interesting as well, since they're the ones developing it. So they will know the technology, and and you get them to brief you up to the gills. You don't need to bring the Chinese or whoever the foreign party is.
Was there a mitigation agreement in that deal?
There was, and it wasn't as intensive as I thought it was going to be. I mean, it was a situation where we put more on the table and got less.
And my guess is that to the extent that there's the interaction that Ivan's talking about, it will influence how tight a mitigation agreement has to be.
But some of the benefits of a mitigation agreement are sitting down with the folks at AT&L and talking about what are the developments. So we did a non-Chinese semiconductor transaction with a very friendly company. And there's a letter of agreement, and I think the best part for both parties is, the biz dev guys go and meet with DoD on a quarterly basis and talk about, here's what's going on in these are potential transactions we see, this is what's going on in the industry, this is what the customer base looks like. So it's an opportunity to educate DoD on what's going on in the marketplace.
And another thing that can be done, and I've suggested this to Dan, the director of DSS, is because they're thinking about all this stuff as well. Dan Payne, I said, look, every company that you're concerned about is putting money into CapEx. Why don't they just brief you on what they're doing and why they're putting money into that particular enterprise? CapEx is, when you're in the for-profit world, a little different from the government where it's all other people's money. It's your money. And so you're going to be very careful about what you are what capital expenditures you're going to undertake. And if you're in a high-tech area, you're going to look at a variety of technologies and see which ones you think have promise. Go and brief Dan Payne and his people at DSS.
Go ahead, I'm sorry, Doug.
No, that'll keep them up to speed.
Let's see if anybody out there has some questions. If not, we're going to call on people. We've got 2 right away, 3. Can we do the one in the back, and then we'll work our way to the front?
Sure.
Guy, you get to ask a question.
I get to ask a question, Ivan. Steve Clements with PwC. One of the things I haven't heard you guys talk about, and from the time that I was in the IC and dealt with a lot of you, was the question of access. You have major technology companies that get tired of a technology that the government has purchased scads of, and they're going to sell a business unit. Well, it's not a question of that technology being the latest and the greatest. It's a question of the company's walking away from it because it's no longer a big moneymaker for them. Mm-hmm. But the technology is just all over the U.S. government.
Yes.
So what about access? Never mind the critical technology piece of it. And there's a number of cases like that out there.
Yeah, I always get clients to say, well, we're just going to walk away from this business. Okay, and you got, a $300 million embedded base in the federal government. You're not going to just walk away from the business. I had a call this morning about, we have all these warranty obligations left for this kind of very sensitive 3-letter agency customer. I just want to walk away from that. I'm like, I guess you don't want to do the deal, So we have to think about that all the time. And sometimes it's pre-positioned, like we're going to go dump X number of machines and we got to deal with the warranty issues. But you're exactly right. I mean, you're a Navy guy, right? The submarine, this comes up all the time in the subsurface, right? Because how expensive is it to take out, you'll know this from you, how expensive is it to take something out of a submarine?
It'll cost you a lot of money.
Yeah, right?
It could be
quiet, it's got to classify.
I mean, we're talking, it could hit 100 million easily.
Right, we had a transaction with a router of submarines, and we had to explain to somebody, you're not going to discontinue this product. And we just have to put a structure around it we had a recent deal involving urethane coatings. And we explained to them how they were going to continue this, ad infinitum.
So this was, I think it's a good question for people that don't know. and I mean, these guys don't know this better than I do, but a lot of the reason for the beginning of CFIUS was just for that reason, right? Is to make sure that our defense, if a foreign company buys something that is providing access and supplies to the Defense Department, and then it creates a huge problem for the Defense Department. It doesn't have to be just the Defense Department, but mainly the Defense Department. Then that is something that CFIUS is supposed to take into account when they look at a transaction. So the national security issue is actually not that there's going to be concern about stealing technology or exfiltration or blah, blah, blah. It's basically, oh my, are we going to be able to do this any longer? And there are, I mean, I remember transactions where the companies had to think through that and there was actually mitigation put around that. The national security issue was to continue supply, essentially. And so, so that is something CFIUS is supposed to be looking at. I can't say that it always does. I just know that that is something.
And it does. I mean, look, I'm on board of a company that's part of a supply chain. And Paul Halpern was very concerned that that company stay in business because it was part of a critical supply chain. Now, they are in business, but clearly it wasn't the technology per se. It was the fact that it was part of a supply chain that was critical.
When I was doing this on the Hill back in the late 80s, early 90s, and right after Desert Storm, I guess all the flat panel displays the Defense Department was buying came from Japan. And the Japanese were having issues about whether or not to support our activities in Desert Storm. And that's an age-old problem we have to deal with.
And you got to think of supply chain the way you might think of allowing an aircraft to fly through somebody's airspace. During the Gulf War, you know, the second Gulf War, Chirac wasn't too excited. The first Gulf War wasn't excited about letting our planes fly over France. Same idea.
That's how we got the Byrd Amendment.
We had one over on the side here, and then we'll come up to the front. Please remember to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Justin Leopold with DHS. I work a little with CFIUS. And as far as critical infrastructure goes, like you've hinted at it a little, all of you, but is it what's being bought or who's buying it? Like if China wants to buy something, we say no, and then Denmark wants to buy it, is that okay?
Well, it does depend on who's buying.
This is our chance to trash yet another ally. So.
And he's in the government, and he's trashing the Danes. You got a problem. I kind of like the Danes myself. This is what we talked about earlier. A meat axe approach doesn't work. I mean, that's basically what I think we're all saying in one way or another. But there are considerations. There are allies and allies. There are non-friends and non-friends as well, actually. And then you look at the critical technologies. And then you look at the state-owned enterprises. And yeah, it's a complex matrix, but I think it's important that we have an updated matrix that allows us to make these sorts of considerations. Because right now, and that doesn't mean that CFIUS isn't working well. It is working well within the parameters it's allowed to work in.
Oh, and FinCEN days they wanted the list of countries.
Yeah, and the hard part about doing a list of countries, to be quite frank with you, is that, you know, some companies are run well in certain countries and some companies aren't run well. Some companies have some serious issues with people that do bad things that are from the same country as a company that really does it right. So to paint things in pure country by country organization, I think is an improper and lacks the nuance that CFIUS currently uses in its evaluation.
No, it's true.
You have a country list?
No, I just was going to add, like, if CFIUS is not doing what you're talking about, which is looking what is the threat, and then what is the vulnerability? The vulnerability is the technology piece, so to speak. I mean, overly simplistic, but yes. And then on the threat side is that Chinese company a decent company, not really creating much problems or so forth, or are they rolling around in bed with the PLA and so forth? And that's what you should be looking at. And the same for the Danish company, even though, you know, on first blush, you're going to say, well, yeah, of course, it's a Danish company, who cares, and Chinese company, but that's what CFIUS process is supposed to be doing.
We had one up in the front, and we had two more in the back.
So I am the infamous Paul Halpern, so been alluded to already. So Clay, I'm going to pose this to you. You raised the question of technology, which the panel tends to agree with, but you also pointed out let's keep the embedded chip in the brain about economic security in the brain, right? I suspect you probably agree with that CFIUS ought to make a distinction between national security and economic, continue to make that distinction. What worries me, and I struggle with this, is in some areas of technology where the acquisition bureaucracy has been pointed out, the technology is moving so fast that the acquisition bureaucracy can't keep up, doesn't see the implications.
Sure.
DARPA may not have gotten there yet, and yet we have cases, some in bankruptcies of venture capital firms, but in others, let's take the Internet of All Things, which seems to be a subdivision of semiconductors, but things are moving so fast that you might get a case on the clock where our traditional ways, meaning the National Defense Agency's way of looking to see if there's a threat, doesn't register, and yet the base needs of a vibrant set of companies, because DoD will eventually, and energy will eventually, and the intel community eventually is going to turn to that base of companies there. So maybe we need on a discretionary basis, a strategic industries subset where CFIUS could say, we're going to block this deal simply because there aren't enough companies left if we allow this one to be foreign owned.
Yeah.
And we have a strong belief that the military will eventually come and asking for it, whether it's through the Silicon Valley office or somewhere else. So, to give an example of a case that we know all of us know about from the trade press, Carmen International, not our father's hi-fi company, but by the time it was sold, was into the Internet of All Things. And so many companies are moving in there now. I use that as an example simply because there are others, that, and yet if we expand the executive order to create such a subcategory, obviously it would allow some administrations to abuse it for other reasons. So I struggle with that, but I sort of come down on the side that maybe we need to broaden the statute in that area. So I'll let you all struggle with that one for a little while.
No, so Paul, thank you. I get what you're saying. You're taking a slightly different theory on what is an economic security test than what you hear from a lot from Capitol Hill, and that's fair. And I think you're trying to be much more nuanced about it, and probably correctly so. You're saying there could be a national security set, a little bit towards the earlier question about supply in some respects. Now, if it is a technology where there are a lot of companies working in that technology, which is what you said.
Sometimes.
But if there's a lot, then the source of supply issue is not much of a problem, because it turns out there's a lot of competitors out there. If, on the other hand, it is something where I get your point, which is it's a technology we're just not sure about. We think it could be really important, but we're not really sure about it, and Department of Defense or NSA or whatever has not gotten their hands around it. And so I guess I could see it, but I think that I already feel like the flexibility is there if it's a supply problem, or if it's an export controlled technology. I assume you're saying this is not export controlled technology. And so I guess my view is I just don't think you have to change that much to handle the situation you're talking about. Let's take a look at semiconductors. In the past year and a half, there has been a number of attempted transactions in the semiconductor space from Chinese companies. It's hard to think, I'm sure there's probably an exception, so what I'm about to say is probably wrong, which is none of them have gotten through. The President of the United States actually blocked one. We've seen a number of companies walk away. I mean, companies have withdrawn and just walked away from those transactions. And I would say, I can think of 6 off the top of my head, right, sitting here, so my guess is it's probably more. Clearly, the Defense Department or some set of agencies said we have a problem here.
Some have gotten through.
And so, and then we had a
fair enough.
report that came out in January, a public-private report saying this is a problem. And so I actually think in that respect, in some respects, the system has worked if that's really a problem. So I don't know enough about semiconductors to say whether it is, but I assume it is. And so
I'm going to go back to the 80s again. I think the problem is you have an acquisition of a struggling company, or a company that's been buffeted by market trends, by a company in a country that engages in predatory trade practices, such that the implication is not just at that specific asset, but are they going to use this asset, A, leapfrog technology, but B, engage through a protected home market, engage in predatory pricing that could drive out the other U.S. players. And that was part of the basis for Exxon Florio back in the 88 Trade Act was you had a country engaged in predatory trade practices, had a protected home market, and had targeted a industry.
Now, one other thing, though, where I think Paul is going here is you can have multiple companies producing the same thing, but not all of them are going to want to work with DoD, okay? Not all of them, even if they want to work with DoD, will be in a position to provide the security. I mean, remember, what are we talking about here? We're talking about classified stuff. In many cases, highly classified stuff. In many cases, what we call black stuff. That requires a certain investment in security that a lot of companies either won't do or can't do. And so so I think, yeah, you're right. There may be many cases where, hey, you're not worried about security of supply. All I'm saying is the considerations may be such that while you think your supply is secure, it may not be as secure as you think.
yeah.
Yeah, the expensive thing is something no spec,
Ah,
right? In a low margin business,
well, exactly.
it's absurd.
Well, you sort of touched on what I was thinking, which is you could look at semiconductors and say the individual transaction may not raise concerns, so we can approve it, and some have been approved. I think of the cases Clay was talking about. But if you aggregate them, is there some kind of strategic effect, either because you're building an industry that will compete and may not compete, as Ivan said, on perfectly fair grounds? So I don't know if that's where you were going, but that's what I was thinking about, is the individual transaction may not raise concern, but there's this strategic effect.
Incremental.
About the tipping point.
Yeah, the incremental. And semiconductors are so widely used and diverse throughout the digital economy and the new economies that they're just a critical part of not only sort of economic, national security, but also economic security.
Yeah, but that all.
Genuine question, does CFIUS really need another tool to do that? I mean, it sounds like there's still the flexibility if you can make that case and connect those dots, that you could use CFIUS to do that. I just, thinking back nostalgically about the 80s and the semiconductor thing with the country you didn't name, but Japan. I mean, remember, it wasn't, first of all, Japan was not a strategic adversary, it was an ally, so I think it's rather different. And if they were doing that, it was probably more about commerce and an economic position, clearly, whereas there were probably mixed motives in the case of China. And I was going to say the response was also not just a sort of defense CFIUS-like thing. We also did Semitech. We also, there's created an ability to be more competitive ourselves with government support. And we went after the Japanese in negotiations to try to get them to not engage in those predatory practices through a variety of means, including ultimately sanctioning them in 1987 for violating a semiconductor agreement, the only time we've sanctioned an ally, I believe, with trade sanctions, in the post-war period. So that was to make a broader point, which is that I know we're focused today on CFIUS and playing defense, but it's just important also to think about sort of economic statecraft in a broader sense, that I think there are at least two other pillars here, one of which is working to get the other countries to to play fair, and there are a variety of ways to do that, more or less successfly. And the other is to invest in ourselves. I mean, to do the things we need to do, everything from having our friggin' subway system work to educating our kids to to investing in a targeted way in R&D and things that will help us compete. So it seems to me we've got to kind of think about all that when we're thinking about this subject, not just defense.
That's why it was part of the '88 Trade Act.
Right.
Not part of it a defense appropriations bill.
Yeah. But your point about Japan and being an ally, I think that's one of the reasons we did have a problem with them. The problem wasn't really a national security problem per se. That's one of the reasons why the ideas that are kicking around the hill, which was your original question, some of which go to, well, are you an ally or not an ally? On the one hand, you may have allies who are trying to steal your stuff. On the other hand, there may be allies, and it's not allies, it's companies. It goes to the gentleman from Homeland who asked this question. It depends on the company, it depends on the people. I mean, it could be a Danish company owned by Russians. Okay, now what are you going to do? You have to have a much higher level of scrutiny, a much higher resolution on these issues.
So I'm cognizant of the value of these gentlemen's time, and I don't want to exploit them overly much. We had 2 remaining questions, so with your permission, perhaps we could get both of those questions asked at the same time, and then you can respond to them. I was going to call on Bill Reinsch and give him the final word, but we may run out of time, in which case you'll be safe, Bill. Okay. Did we have 2 questions? I think we have oh gosh, we have 3 now. Well, why don't we do all 3, and then we'll let the panel escape.
Thank you. I'm Danielle Capalbo. I traveled all the way from Boston to attend your talk. My question is that
You
I would
sound
like...
disappointed.
No, I'm not. Thank you. I want to use a very recent purchase of a company as an example and a test case and get your opinion on this. A very highly regarded company called IDC/IDG based in Boston was recently purchased by the Chinese. For those who don't know what this company does, it is a research company that analyzes technology by sector, and then lots of US companies look to them for opinions. It was purchased by the Chinese a couple of months ago. Even though it may not pass your test as a security defense type of technology, I see that as a very strategic company with lots of implications. So that's my question and comment.
Okay, question 1, question 2.
Yes, Paul Triolo from your Asia Group. I have an easy question and a hard question. Actually, I have 2 questions.
Okay.
The first question is, can you cite examples of where CFIUS has clearly failed? I'd like a couple of really concrete examples would be interesting. I can think of a few. And then secondly, in reading the New York Times report about the DIUX report, which is embargoed, I gather, I was a little troubled to see the term sensitive technology used with essentially advanced technologies like AI, automation, VR. These are, and so in the sense that they're being labeled as sensitive, it's not surprising that Chinese companies and other companies are investing in these technologies. So I found that a little bit disturbing. So in terms of a list of technologies, how do you differentiate on a list of technologies between, what is sort of the flavor of the month or the technology of the month that everybody is investing in, and critical technologies that are really critical to protect, because these are all inherently dual use, and it seems really more and more difficult to differentiate those kinds of technologies.
And then our final question, but could you tell us the cases you think were failures? Because I've known a lot of messy cases, but I don't know if I'd call them failures. I mean, for CFIUS.
I'd like to hear from the
Okay, and then our final question then.
Thanks. Curtis Eichelberger at MLEX. We cover antitrust. And I'd just like to get on the line and have each person say, if I could change CFIUS in just one way, here's the way I would do it, whatever you think is most important.
Okay, so IDG, sensitive technologies, and failures, single change. Why don't we start with Matt and go down the road?
I'll just take the last one, which is I think I would give it more resource to be able to really analyze the sort of broad set of issues that surround transactions in the modern economy that are much more complicated and involve a lot more moving parts. And I think that's probably the single most useful thing I would do.
Unfortunately, I don't know the case you're talking about. Sounds maybe like it should have gone through CFIUS, but I just don't know anything about it, so it's hard for me to answer. I'm interested in hearing. I don't know of any. Like that's the thing that bothers me. Is like, where did a case go kablooey? And as Nova just said, not from a PR perspective or like Dubai Court World or something like that, but like where you actually we missed it, and we may have harmed our national security one way or the other. Actually, I think Ivan threw out in some respects one of the better examples, which was actually from the mitigation agreement where CFIUS went too far, didn't go far enough. I guess to your question about legislation, I kind of gave my view, which is that I guess I'd do a few things. One, if you're going to change something, evaluate it. And so Congress properly asked for an evaluation. 10 years later, get the evaluation. Then, based on that, since now I'm going to go against my own advice, and since I'm just evaluating based on my own knowledge as opposed to a professional study, I would probably, if I had to make any changes, I would probably do something more along the lines of trying to look at whether or not there's more you could do, kind of a little bit of mandatory with state-owned enterprise and maybe marry it up with critical technology, kind of where Ivan and David going back and forth. I could see landing there.
I think I can link your first question with the third question, which is this. It's pretty clear to me that somebody should have looked at at the issue you raised, and that's one of the things I think needs to be done. We need to broaden the scope. We need to be careful about how we broaden the scope. We shouldn't just legislate, do all this stuff. And secondly, to the extent we do broaden the scope, we need more people. And we need more people who are really expert at what they're talking about. So if you're going to broaden the scope and not add the people, you're just going to fall on your face for the reasons that you gave earlier. They're already overloaded. On the issue of critical technologies, because I think you deserve an answer on that, I would define it as either something that we don't want someone else to have because it'll hurt us, or something that we need because it'll help us. And if it fits those definitions, in other words, not enabling somebody to shoot us down, but enabling us to shoot them down, then I would call it a critical technology.
Case clearly, if it wasn't reviewed, to me that's kind of a no-brainer. That goes to the issue of resources and whether or not the agencies have enough resources to follow this.
It was reviewed. It was.
It was reviewed, yeah. This is IDG, right? Yeah, so.
Okay,
so it was reviewed.
I'm assuming the CFIUS guys did a professional
and
job.
I assume they approved it.
Okay. So you had enough people to review it. Good, good.
Then the system's working.
There you have it.
Okay.
Single change. God, I hate limiting it to one single thing, but I'm going to try. And he's going to hate it. So this is really. You got to get rid of unanimity, and you need to let the parties, engage with the agencies. And I don't say you can send a divided recommendation to the president, but the amount of time and effort that's wasted on arguing about whether or not you need mitigation, when you know you're going to end up with mitigation, is a waste of resources for the company, creates market uncertainty. And I don't think it serves the agencies well either. So I think, being able to engage with the lead agency one-on-one is the biggest thing I would try.
Well, to that end, I think there's some things you can do in tinkering in terms of CFIUS the chair and the lead agency being represented in all the meetings. But it goes to Clay's point. You don't want to be responsible for a process and not know what's going on in the process. And prior to the consensus-driven approach of FINSA, CFIUS was a Wild West where any one agency could hijack the process and determine what was going to be the outcome of that transaction without the deliberative process that CFIUS now has because of how it's been structured. That's allowed companies that ought not to be mitigated because the Department of Defense or other agency didn't do its due diligence not to have exhaustive mitigation that limits their ability to economically compete in the sector out there.
By the time you reach your consensus, though, it's day 4.
I agree, but that goes to the big issue, which goes to a number of the questions and whether, when you really mess up in Washington, it's not so much a policy you believe in, it's a process you failed at. So the biggest failure of CFIUS was Dubai Ports World, not because what it did, the approval was wrong, it's the process wasn't done right. So it's getting the process right and making sure it fills in the gaps where it has empty spaces. Now, in terms of technology, sensitive technologies, critical technologies, it's part of a report that CFIUS has to put out every year. It means they evaluate what things are critical and sensitive, and they do their evaluation and incorporate that in their deliberative process. Going to process, sounds like your transaction was captured. I hope appropriate mitigation was and address the national security issues. And then finally, to your issue, what should change in terms of, for me, it's a process issue. And I think we have a serious gap in terms of the non-notified process. And if it means internally making sure that that's strengthened to capture those instances so there's not a, oh my goodness, no one saw it and did the appropriate evaluation to be able to answer that in a public forum, then that has to be addressed.
I'll answer the one question that got missed somehow, which is there are a couple semiconductor joint ventures that I think probably deserve extra scrutiny. And at least that might be an export control issue more than a CFIUS issue. And there's at least one of them where I was sort of, having done this for a while, a little surprised that it happened. And the only one that I'd point to isn't really a US one, but I'd point to KUKA, where the German robotics firm, not us, but I think even the Germans now feel pangs of regret over that transaction. But on our score, I think the CFIUS process is actually done pretty well. We need to maybe look at it. You certainly heard a lot of suggestions for tweaks. These are the people who would know, and so please join me in thanking them for coming here and speaking today.